Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I'm supposed to be off this week. I've got friends here visiting town, and then also my band is currently recording our album, and I'll have more information about that one later. But we just got a bunch of news about the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, so I want to put together a quick video going over all these details. They've been teasing it for a couple weeks now, but they finally dropped the specs, and so that's what we're going to focus on here in this video, and do a little bit of speculation about things like price and release date, because we don't know those just yet. Either way, grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's dive in talking about the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. And to start, you're probably wondering, what is the Retroid Pocket Flip 2? And this is the Retroid Pocket Flip 1 right here. So this is a clamshell version of the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. This one came out about 2 years ago at this point. So this one wasn't really an upgrade in terms of the chip as well as the screen. It was the same stuff, just in a different form factor. And based on the information we learned today, it looks to be the exact same thing this time around with the Flip 2. They're going to have two different models this time, the Snapdragon 865, which we saw in the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Retroid Pocket Mini, but then also the Dimensity 1100. That's the same chip that we saw in the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. So they're really just going back to the two previous generations of devices and making clamshell options for those. Now, I'm assuming there's going to be a price difference between these two because the Snapdragon 865 has a little bit better performance and a couple other features that we'll talk about here in a minute. But before that, let's talk about some of these specs because there's not a lot of difference between the two model options. The only big differences between the two besides the chipset have to do with things like the Bluetooth version, so 5.2 on the Dimensity, but only 5.1 on the Snapdragon. That's because it's an older chip. But it does look like the charging speed is in the Snapdragon's favor, so this one can go up to 27 watt fast charge, whereas the Dimensity only goes up to 18. These both have a 5000 milliamp hour battery. It just means the Snapdragon will charge a little bit more quickly. Now, in terms of the other specs, everything else is going to be standard. So they both will have 8 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage. And as we saw in their trailer video about a week ago, it will have a microSD card slot, so you will be able to expand the storage easily. The Flip 2 will also have active cooling, which is really important with a clamshell device because you don't want it to get warm, and so that's going to be great. The original Flip also had active cooling. It was actually the first Retroid device to have it, and it was not great. The fan didn't sound good. It didn't do a very good job of cooling off the device either, and so I'm hoping that because we've seen a lot of improvements with the 4 and the 4 Pro and the 5 and the Mini, that we will see some improvements with the Flip 2 as well. Probably one of the most important factors is that this device will have the same screen as the Retroid Pocket 5, so 5.5 inches, 1080p AMOLED that can get up to 500 nits of peak brightness. And it's no secret that I love the Retroid Pocket 5 screen. I think it is amazing. It's got beautiful color saturation, it's nice and vibrant. I love the size of a 5.5 inch device, and it also gets really dim and really bright. So I've got no complaints about this screen, and I'm really looking forward to trying it on a clamshell. If you want to consoleize the device, you're going to be able to use DisplayPort video out for 1080p 60 frames per second, so you'll basically be able to plug this into like a monitor or a TV and play your games on that as well. And both models will also come with a Wi-Fi 6 as well as Android 13. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the differences between the two chipsets, because at face value, they actually look very similar, and the Dimensity pulls ahead in some certain benchmarks. These both have 8-core CPUs, but it's the GPU that makes a huge difference with these devices. The Snapdragon has an Adreno 650, which is a bit of an older GPU, but it is still a lot more compatible than the Mali GPU found in the Dimensity model. And this will come into play when it comes to emulation. I found that PS2 games run better on the Snapdragon chip, and when it comes to higher end emulation like Nintendo Switch, it also does better. Now, neither of these chips are really great for Nintendo Switch emulation, but I would rather do it on the Snapdragon than the Dimensity. In addition, the Snapdragon can take advantage of third-party turnip drivers, which you can load up in certain emulators that also improve compatibility, and so that's going to improve things like Nintendo Switch as well. It also will do better in other tasks like WinLater, which allows you to play Windows PC games on Android. You're going to be able to run turnip drivers with certain builds of that app as well, and in general, compatibility will just be better on the Snapdragon 865. But for me, the most important distinguishing factor between the two is that the Snapdragon 865 can boot into Linux, and we already have custom firmwares that work on it. We've already got operating systems like Rocknix and Batocera running on the Retroid Pocket 5, and so I expect that in short time we will also see the same things running on the Flip 2. And these custom firmwares open up a whole world of possibility outside of Android. It allows you to run things like original Xbox and PS3 emulation. Now the performance is not great on them, but it's always fun to tinker around with that, and we have the additional options with Linux. You can also run things like native Pico 8 and Portmaster on Rocknix, which also opens up the world even more. I've made a whole video about talking about Linux on these handhelds, and I'm due to make another one as well because I've been messing around with it for a while and I love it. So this is just another reason why, if I'm going to pick between the two, I'm going with the Snapdragon on the Flip 2. Now, you might be wondering why you would even want to consider the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 if maybe you already have the Retroid Pocket 5 or you've already been thinking about it. Why would you consider the clamshell instead? And there are a couple reasons why I think it would be worth considering. Number one is the fact that it's going to have the exact same screen. So this beautiful 5.5-inch screen will be in the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. The original Flip 1 has a 4.7-inch screen, which can get a little bit small, but then also it's just a regular IPS LCD. And so this is going to be a big improvement in terms of visual quality. Another thing to think about is that a clamshell form factor kind of pushes the screen closer to your face. If you think about as you're like holding it and playing it, the screen is higher and kind of pushed towards you, and you obviously can adjust the angle as well. And so this allows you to kind of have a more immersive experience compared to something like the Retroid Pocket 5, where you're just kind of holding one single piece. This is still a great experience, but I do think that the clamshell form factor with a larger device, like a larger screen like this, is more immersive. And so as long as they can like pull off the controls and they actually feel really good, this might be a superior experience for some people. Another consideration is that the Retroid Pocket Flip for me, the original one that came out a couple years ago, really felt like the first Android-based handheld that felt like its own handheld console. A lot of these other ones, including the Retroid Pocket 5, basically feel like a phone or a tablet with controls slapped on. But the clamshell form factor for me just elevates it a little bit more. You can open it up, jump into your games, and so I've really loved this overall experience. It reminds me, obviously, of like playing a DS or a 3DS, but with my more like retro-focused games, not necessarily my two-screen games. Another more obvious thing about a clamshell is that it's self-protecting. When you close it up, the screen and the controls are going to be protected, as opposed to something like the Retroid Pocket 5, which will need some sort of carrying case if you really want to keep it protected. And looking at the spec sheet, the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 is going to be about 300 grams, and the Retroid Pocket 5 was 272, so we're looking at about a 10% difference between the two, which is pretty impressive considering all the plastic that goes into a clamshell device. And so I'm liking the fact that it's not going to be much heavier than the Retroid Pocket 5, which I think feels really great. And so that's why I'm excited about the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. I love like clamshell devices and the fact that they're a bit more immersive, the screen's closer to your face, and you have the ability to protect it as well. And so there's a lot of benefits to this. Now let's talk about some things that seem to be a little bit different from the Retroid Pocket Flip to the Flip 2. And so we'll start with the control scheme because these analog sticks are unique. To start, let's take a look at the old control scheme. So the D-pad and the face buttons were both rubber membranes, so a little bit clacky and just kind of an old school feeling. I didn't really enjoy these controls that much, but that's what we had to work with. And looking at the graphics, it seems like the Retroid Pocket 5 controls are going to carry over to the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. I love this D-pad. The face buttons, not quite as much, but they're still very good. Not quite to the point of being a 10 out of 10, but I would say together they're like an 8 out of 10, which is not bad. The original Flip also had analog sliders, much like a Nintendo 3DS, but they did click down L3, R3, which was kind of unique. Now, these were varied devices. Some people loved them, some people hated them. I was kind of in the middle, so I thought they were pretty good for like single analog slider games, like playing like a Nintendo 64 game, or maybe like an arcade game. I thought it got the job done. But I did not like their reach here. I thought that the distance from the analog sliders to the triggers was a bit much. Now, the control scheme on the new models is totally different. You can see that the analog sticks are above the D-pad and face buttons, and they're also outboard. And I've heard a lot of grumblings online about people saying this is going to be great or terrible, and again, I'm somewhere in the middle here where I think it has potential of being pretty good. First of all, they are going to be analog sticks, so they're probably going to use the same sticks as they've had here in the Retroid Pocket 5, which are Hall sensor and have a nice wide range of motion. These sticks themselves are also relatively small, but I expect them to be more inset into the device to make room for the screen and the clamshell form factor. They did also show that the caps are going to be different, so they're going to be a lot grippier, which I think is probably going to make it easy, so that way if it's really inset into the device, if you've got something really grippy, you can at least still feel around. Now there are other clamshells that have the same design. This guy right here is the GPD XD Plus. This is a really old Android-based clamshell. In fact, this thing came out before I even got into handhelds in the first place. But as you can see, the layout here of the controls is very similar to the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. And so this allows us to glean a bunch of information from it. Number one is that, this control scheme is actually pretty comfortable. You can reach the sticks easily, you can reach the D-pad easily, and you can swap between the two very easily too. Also, when using twin stick games, it's not that much of a reach from the analog sticks over to the shoulders and triggers. Now, this one has actual inline shoulder and trigger buttons like a 3DS, so it's not going to be the same experience. So if anything, the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 might be more comfortable because we will have that full outboard trigger like this. And by the way, the triggers are going to be Hall sensor on the Flip 2 as well, so that is probably going to give us a lot of nice precision. Now, it's not going to be an apples to apples comparison with the GPD XD Plus because this one has like PS Vita style analog sticks and they do not click down. You can see it had dedicated L3 and R3 buttons on the side. But at the very least, I can tell you that this is a pretty comfortable setup, but it does take some adjustment just because the analog sticks are up top compared to other devices. Now, we've seen other devices with analog sticks up top. For example, the Wii U famously had that on their gamepad, and a lot of people thought this was really comfortable. The Steam Deck is also somewhat similar in that regard. The controls are not above or below, but they're all sort of in a line, which means that your thumbs can just access them all easily. I also recently reviewed this controller, which had analog sticks up top. This is called the Scuff Nomad. It's made for iPhones and iPads, and it's really nice, really comfortable, especially with more modern games, like playing twin stick games. Now, trying to reach down and hit the D-pad and the face buttons at the same time is a little bit more awkward, but again, this one has like really protruding thumbsticks, so it's a bit more of a travel, and so not quite a good comparison either. At the very least, I think it's an improvement when it comes to analog stick gaming because reaching down like this does feel a little bit unnatural. And so I think something like this kind of layout where you can just kind of hit them both easily is going to be a very good setup. But bear in mind that a control scheme like this may just feel generally unnatural for most people because we just don't have a lot of gamepads with this type of design. While I have the GPD out, another thing worth talking about is that the speaker placement is very similar here as well. They are front-facing on the Flip 2. Initially, when I saw the diagrams, I thought, oh no, we're going to cover them with our palms. But in general, as you can see as I'm holding it, a little bit of my hand goes over it, but if anything, it just kind of funnels the sound up to your ears. And so I think this is going to be a much better audio experience than the original Flip. The original Flip had like backwards firing sound, and so that's never ideal. And so I like the fact that they at least pushed the speakers up front. That was one of my big complaints about the original device. Now, the last bit of information that we can probably glean from the XD Plus is the overall size of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. This one had a 5-inch screen, but you can see that it had really big bezels, both on the sides of the device, but within the screen as well. And so I think that they're probably going to be able to take this 5.5-inch screen and put it directly into something around this size. And so I'm expecting the Flip 2 will really be about this size altogether. It's definitely going to be thicker because these analog triggers are going to be sticking out a little bit more, but in general, I'm expecting it to be somewhat similar. And to give you an idea, that's about the same size as like a Nintendo 2DS XL. So if you have something around this size laying around, then this is probably what the Flip is going to be like, but just a little bit thicker. Now let's talk about the 4 different color options that we have here at launch. At the top left, we have what they're calling ice blue. It looks a little bit more green to me, but still very nice. The main Retroid Pocket Flip that I've been using over the years is the transparent red model, so I like that they're sticking with a transparent color option. To the right of that, we've got what they're calling the GC version, which obviously stands for GameCube. And I really want to love this model, but the button layout has always driven me crazy. It was the same thing with the Retroid Pocket 5. If we look at an original GameCube controller, this is my Wavebird one right here, you can see that the A button is right here in the center. So this is your primary button when playing GameCube, one of my favorite consoles of all time. From there, all the other buttons just kind of surround it. So we have X to the right, we have Y above it, and then we have the B button a little bit to the left and then down. And many games were programmed with this in mind. So you're going to have your A button like this, and then you will shift over accordingly to hit these other ones. However, with the Retroid model, they just take the literal translation of what A and B actually are, and then just put the colors on those. And for me, this just does not work when it comes to GameCube games. The A button is on the far right, the B button is down below, and then the X and Y are both above above and to the left. And so generally what I recommend in all of my setup guides for these Retroid devices, when you're mapping the GameCube controls, I do it the opposite, where I have a button in the bottom center. From there, the other buttons kind of surround it. It's not perfect, but it's still a lot closer to the original layout than what they're showing here with the GC version of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. And so personally, even though I love the GameCube and I love this color scheme, it's not one that I can really work with. It kind of breaks my brain. And so unfortunately, I probably won't be getting this model. On the bottom left, we've got a black model, and generally I'm a little bit wary of these colors just because they can sometimes be smudgy depending on the plastic. So the jury's still out on this one, but I do like how clean it looks. Everything is nice and black, and then we have a pop of color from the RGBs that are coming from the analog sticks. And then finally on the bottom right, we have what they call 16-bit US, which is the Super Nintendo North American model. And so this one actually looks the cleanest to me. It's got a nice light gray look to it, and so this is probably the one that I'm going to pre-order myself. It's also worth noting that on the top of the lid there looks to be something going on here, some sort of logo or design. And so that's a look at all 4 color models. I'm probably going to avoid the GameCube one just because my heart wants it, but my brain does not. And then also the transparent model will be a little bit interesting as it rolls out. It's well known that transparent models can be more brittle than the solid color models, and that mostly has to do with UV light and everything. And so often people will get worried about transparent models and the hinges on them actually cracking. For example, we've seen that with the RG35XX SP devices from Anbernic. The transparent ones seem to break the hinge more often than the solid ones. Now for my part, I've mostly been using 2 different Retroid Pocket Flips over the years, and it's the solid one that has a hairline fracture for me. It's really hard to see, but hopefully my camera can pick it up. But yeah, this thing developed after maybe the first 6 months or a year after use. It never really affected the gameplay or anything, but it was just a little thing that bothered me and just made me worry about the lifetime of this device. Now about a month or so after the Retroid Pocket Flip first came out, they were getting a lot of people that were cracking the hinges on their devices, especially the shiny red color one, which was like a really neat sport car looking device. And so they ended up going back to the drawing board and reinforcing the hinge. They made a whole hoopla about it about 2 years ago. And so they learned those lessons and kind of reinforced it from there. And a lot of those issues with the cracked hinge really didn't happen after that. And they'd make a point to say that the new device is going to have a reinforced hinge. So I'm hoping they've taken all those lessons they've learned over the years with the original Flip and put them into practice with this one as well. Now the hinge on any clamshell device is going to be that weak point, and so I still think it's probably not going to be 100%, but I'm hoping that it at least will be better than it was at launch with the original Flip. But bear in mind that Retroid does have a tendency to mess up something with every single launch. Sometimes it's really minor, like the coloring on the screen, and then they fix it with a software update. But just bear in mind that, something's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to be the hinge, but just be on the lookout for that. There's always a risk being an early adopter of any device, but it's rung pretty true with Retroid as well. So something to be mindful about in case you're scrambling to get this on day one. Now, one thing I do like is they say it's going to have a 150-degree hinge, which is probably going to be very similar to this angle on the Nintendo 3DS, but then it'll also go back a full 180 as well. And so I think that's going to be pretty great. It's going to give us a good amount of options to work with when it comes to angles and getting that perfect degree for everything that you want to play. So I am looking forward to testing out this hinge and seeing how it's going to work, and I think just on paper at least, it's got everything that I would want to see in a clamshell handheld. Now another comment I've seen a lot over the years, with both the original Flip and now with the Flip 2, is people lament the fact that it doesn't have a second screen. They're like, there's a bunch of wasted space right here. Why can't they just throw a second screen in here so we can play our DS and 3DS games? And I think a lot of that is wishful thinking, and I personally would love to have a 2-screen Android-based device as well, but it is not a very practical solution. Let me walk you through this whole thing. The first thing to consider is just using Android in a dual screen setup. Now, I think things are easier in 2025 than they were, years ago, but still, Android is not really meant to have a 2-screen setup. There are now foldable phones and even dual screen phones like the Surface Duo, but even those are still pretty few and far between. Not only that, the only systems you're really going to emulate with a 2-screen setup are going to be like Nintendo DS and 3DS. And both of those consoles don't really have a good way of emulating on Android right now. My favorite Nintendo DS emulator is Drastic, which was just removed from the Google Play Store about 2 weeks ago. We think the developer just took it down on their own volition, but still, there's no official way to download that app right now. You have to go to some website, find it, and then download it. That app does allow you to use 2-screen gameplay, but it depends on the implementation of the Android, because because if I remember correctly, it really just lets you make one big screen, and then you have to adjust things across the two screens instead. There are other DS emulator options out there, like the cores within RetroArch, and I think there's Melon DS as well, but they are not at the point of drastic in terms of all the features and whatnot. So even playing DS games on Android is a bit of a limited experience. It's a similar story with 3DS, because Citra, which was the main emulator up until about a year ago and it was taken down by Nintendo, that one is no longer in production either. There are other options like forks and stuff like Lime 3DS, but even then, those are no longer on the Play Store, and so you don't have a lot of options when it comes to 3DS emulation either. Not only that, Nintendo has a bunch of patents for the words dual screen gaming console. In fact, they just released a new patent or trademark for it, I think about a year ago at this point, and a lot of people thought that was for the Switch too, but it just goes to show that that's another risk. If you are a company, a smaller company like Retroid, are you going to make a dual screen gaming console and potentially get the attention of Nintendo in that route? I'm not really sure if that's worth it either. The only dual screen device we've seen in recent years is this thing from Ioneo. It's called the Flip DS, but this is very different. This is a handheld PC. You could argue that this is essentially just a laptop that happens to have controls on it. And so this I would not categorize as being a gaming console in the same way that something like a Retroid Pocket Flip would be. And so that might be the distinction right there in terms of whether or not it's even worth making a dual screen device. And of course, Windows is better set up for dual monitor setups. If you think about, just your typical computer that's hooked up to two different screens, that's already kind of taken care of in the software. Unlike with Android, you would have to have a special build that would support it. So I think that's a lot of work and a lot of maybes for just two specific systems, Nintendo DS and 3DS. I love those systems as well. I want to emulate them very easily, but I'm not sure if that juice is worth the squeeze. I still think that if you want to play DS and 3DS games, your best bet is an actual 3DS. This is going to be able to get jailbroken. You can play all sorts of games on it. This is just a much better experience, and unfortunately, Android is just not there yet. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to speculate about is the pricing. So I don't have any official numbers or anything else like that, but if I was to guess, I would say that the Dimensity is going to be cheaper, and I would put it around $200 or so, and I would say that the Snapdragon is going to be around $250. Now, there was only like a $20, maybe $10 price difference between the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and the Retroid Pocket Flip, which had the same chip at the time. And so maybe we'll see something like that, like maybe there's only a $10 or $20 difference between the two, but conservatively, I would expect, $200 and $250. So that's about probably what we're looking at. As far as release timing, knowing Retroid and when they start to tease things like this, I would expect pre-orders to start very soon, probably in the next couple weeks, and then shipping maybe a couple weeks after that. One thing I hope they do is they also sell a grip case with the Flip 2. They had one with the original Flip 1, and it was kind of ingenious. You can see it has these little pulls right here, so those would actually plug into the holes on the actual screw holes, and so that's how it actually held into place. Now, this did not transform the controls of the Retroid Pocket Flip, but it did make it a lot easier to use. You had more to grip onto. You still have that big distance between these sticks and the triggers, but it's a lot more palatable, I think, with these grips. And so I'm hoping they make something like this. Otherwise, we'll have to rely on the community and 3D printed options. And the last thing I wanted to bring up before we close out is that Retroid was teasing a second device. So their very first image that they released was this here with the Pocket Flip 2, but then also there's that little guy in the back, a little bit darker and a little bit smaller. So I got no idea what this is, but my guess is it's going to be a small clamshell, something like a Miu Flip or like the old Game Boy Advance SP, or it could be just a vertical handheld like a Game Boy Color. The original Retroid Pocket 1 was a vertical handheld, so maybe they're going that route this time. Either way, on the graphic it does mention that it's a spring release, and so we should probably be hearing about this one pretty soon. Anyway, that's really all the thoughts I have on the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. I'm kind of excited about it. I like the idea of having my Retroid Pocket 5, but in a clamshell form factor. Now, I love the 5. This thing is one of my favorite devices ever made. And so I'm not sure if it's going to dethrone it, but I love the fact that they're trying. And so we'll see how this all goes. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you already have a Retroid Pocket 5? Or do you have something else you're happy with it? Or are you looking forward to this one? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.